Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of PsychCasts. Today we'll be doing a AP Psychology unit review again, and as requested, we'll be doing Unit 7, which is Motivation, Emotion, and Personality. So starting off with motivation. Motivation is defined as the need/desire that directs a behavior. And within desire, there are two different drives. You have primary drive and you have secondary drive. Primary drive is the desire to obtain things that help with basic survival. For instance, food, water, sleep. On the other hand, secondary drives is the desire to obtain learned reinforcers. Learned reinforcers are things like money, social status, social popularity, etc. Now let's go over some motivation theories, starting off with instinct theory. And before I explain what instinct theory is, let's define what instinct is. Instinct is a genetically programmed pattern of behavior. And so instinct theory basically states that an instinct will motivate a certain behavior. For instance, something I think that is pretty fascinating is that when we don't know something, we just instinctively shrug our shoulder. Now let's talk about arousal theory. Arousal theory basically states that behaviors are motivated by our desire for a physiological arousal. An example of this would be that someone will go skydive because they want to chase the adrenaline high, which in this case would be the physiological arousal. Speaking of arousal, a law that I should mention is the Yerkes-Dodson law. This law states that tasks that are moderately difficult, so not too easy and not too hard, will elicit the highest level of performance. For instance, for me, if I were to read a children's book, it probably wouldn't elicit the highest level of performance because it's too easy. But if I were to read a professor's thesis, it probably wouldn't elicit the highest level of performance either because it would be too difficult. Now let's talk about drive reduction theory. This basically states that a physiological need will put stress on the body, and this stress will motivate us to reduce it by performing a subsequent behavior. For instance, we feel lightheaded, we don't feel good when we're hungry, and so this tension, lightheadedness, whatever the case may be, motivates us to reduce it by eating something. So again, the drive in this example would be hunger, and the reduction would be eating and feeding ourselves. Now let's talk about humanistic theories of motivation. And what humanistic psychologists often say is that needs arise from unsatisfied levels of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. For instance, if you're not physiologically satisfied, you will be motivated to satisfy that need by, for instance, searching out for food, for water, shelter, whatever the case may be. Now let's talk about cognitive theories of motivation. And cognitive psychologists believe that there are multiple factors that motivate behavior. Starting off with intrinsic motivation or intrinsic factors. These are factors that originate within ourselves. For instance, I might just really enjoy reading, so it's an intrinsic motivation. On the other hand, extrinsic factors or extrinsic motivations are things that originate from the outside world. For instance, I might read because my parents will pay me a quarter for every page that I read. And so the desire to read doesn't originate from within ourselves, rather originates from the outside world. An effect relating intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation is the over-justification effect. This effect states that intrinsic behaviors will become less enjoyable if they are receiving extrinsic rewards. For instance, I might enjoy reading, but the moment that I start getting paid for every page that I read, I'll start enjoy reading less. Some other cognitive theories to mention is self-determination. This is a need to feel competent and in control of something, and oftentimes this need will motivate you to perform a certain behavior. Another theory is self-efficacy. This is the belief that we can or cannot attain a goal. And the higher the self-efficacy of an individual, the more likely they are to believe that they can indeed attain said goal. Another theory is cognitive dissonance. This is motivation to reduce the tension created from conflicting behaviors and thoughts. So for instance, you might change your behavior to match your thoughts. There are 4 types of conflicts in AP psychology that you need to know. First is approach conflict. This is when one has 2 very desirable options that they need to pick between. On the other hand, there's something called avoidance conflict. This is when you have 2 undesirable options that you need to pick between. So picking between the lesser one of the 2 evil. The next conflict is approach avoidance conflict. This is when you only have one choice, but this choice has both pros and cons. Last but not least, you have the multiple approach avoidance conflict. This is when many options are presented, but each of these options have both pros and cons. Now let's talk about hunger. And this might sound a little off topic, but hunger actually does relate to motivation. The part of your brain that controls hunger is called the hypothalamus. And within the hypothalamus, you have the lateral hypothalamus and you have the ventral medial hypothalamus. Your lateral hypothalamus evokes feeding, so it causes you to want to eat. Well, on the other hand, the ventral medial hypothalamus stops you eating. So our body regulates weight through, for instance, food intakes, energy outputs, and something called the basal metabolic rate. This is the rate of energy used for simply maintaining the bodily functions at rest. So even if you were to lay down on your bed for a whole entire day, your body's still going to burn some calories because of your basal metabolic rate. Now for the fun part, let's talk about some hormones that are related to hunger. Starting off with insulin. Insulin controls your blood glucose, and just remember that if insulin goes up, blood glucose goes down. Then another hormone is called leptin. Leptin decreases hunger, and its counterpart is the orexin, which triggers hunger. Some other hormones is ghrelin. Ghrelin is secreted by an empty stomach, and the way I like to remember this is that an empty stomach grumbles. So ghrelin, grumble, kind of like a little correlation there. On the other hand, you have abastatin. Abastatin is secreted by a full stomach, and since it starts with an O, I think that an O kind of symbolizes what a stomach looks like when it's full. Now let's go over the 3 eating disorders. So starting off with anorexia nervosa. This is when a person, usually a teenage female, diets and becomes underweight, but yet still feels fat and continues to starve themselves. Another eating disorder is bulimia nervosa. This is when you alternate between periods of binging and purging. A similar eating disorder to bulimia nervosa is binge eating disorder. This is periods of binge eating episodes followed by stress, guilt, but there is no purging, no vomiting, no excess exercise. And it's this last part that differentiates binge eating disorder from bulimia nervosa. Now let's dive into emotions. Emotions is defined as a response of an organism involving physiological arousal, expressive behaviors, and conscious experience. And there are 3 main theories of emotions mentioned on the AP exam. Starting off with James Lange theory. This is when an environmental stimuli causes a physiological change and response. So if you kind of think of it as like a flow chart, if you will, you have a stimulus, you have a physiological response, and then you have the experience of emotion. An example would be a loud noise causes your heart rate to increase, and this increase in heart rate then causes you to feel, shocked or surprised or fear, those emotions. The next theory is called the Cannon-Bar theory. This theory states that environmental stimuli simultaneously causes physiological response and experience of emotion. For instance, when you see a tarantula, your heart rate will increase simultaneously as you experience the emotion of fear. Last but not least, you have the 2-factor theory, or what's called as Schachter-Singer theory. This theory states that to experience emotion, you must be physically aroused and cognitively label that arousal. For instance, you have a stimulus, which will cause a physiological response. Once that physiological response is caused, you need to cognitively label that response in order to finally feel the emotion. For instance, if we cry at a wedding, we need to label the physiological response of crying as a feeling of happiness in order to truly experience the emotion of happiness. Whereas if we were to cry at a funeral, we need to cognitively label that crying as a sign of sadness to experience sadness. Now let's move on to the limbic system. This is the main area of the brain that is responsible for emotions, and specifically within the limbic system, you have the amygdala. And the amygdala is responsible for producing fear. And just some other random facts that you should know. Although there are various theories of emotions, one thing for sure is that facial expressions of emotions is universal. No matter which culture you're in, a smile always means happiness and a frown always means sadness. Speaking of facial emotions, there is a very cool hypothesis called the facial feedback hypothesis, which is the idea that a person's facial expression can influence their actual emotion being processed. So for instance, if you were to feel sad, you literally start fake smiling, and the hypothesis states that you'll eventually begin to feel happiness, and or at least a little less depressed. Some other things to know is the 6 basic emotions, which is anger, fear, disgust, surprise, happiness, and sadness. The last thing I will talk about emotion is catharsis. Catharsis is a hypothesis that releasing aggressive energy, whether that's through actions or fantasies, release aggressive urges. For instance, if you feel very angry, releasing that anger, whether it's through boxing or whatever, can relieve the aggressive energies. Next, let's talk about stress. So stress is defined as the process by which we perceive and respond to certain events that we appraise as threatening or challenging. And a key concept related to stress that you need to know is called GAS, or the General Adaptation Syndrome, which is a concept of the body's response to stress in 3 phases: alarm, resistance, and exhaustion. Alarm is the sudden activation of your sympathetic nervous system. So you have increased heart rate, which puts you in the fight or flight response. And this will then prepare you to fight whatever challenge is in front of you. Next phase is resistance. This is when the parasympathetic nervous system starts to reduce the arousal state. However, if the stressor were to continue to remain, meaning your body continues to stay in that arousal state, this will deplete your body's energy, and eventually you will reach the 3rd stage, exhaustion. And this kind of taps into a little bit of personality, but something regarding behavior patterns in response to stress. There are mainly 2 type of people, if you will, type A and type B, which I've heard, which I'm sure many of you guys have heard before. So type A is a behavior of competitiveness, sense of time urgency, and elevated feelings of anger and hostility. And typically type A people respond to stress quickly and more aggressively compared to type B, which is a behavior of low competitiveness, low preoccupations with time issues, and easygoing attitude overall. Now let's talk about something that is probably not going to be tested on the AP exam, but it's good to know. And that is the sexual response cycle. So there are 4 stages of sexual response. You have excitement, plateau, orgasm, and resolution. And a key thing to know is that during the resolution, the male will enter the refractory period, which is the resting period after an orgasm, where a man cannot have another orgasm. Now let's finally dive into my favorite topic in AP psychology throughout my whole year, and that was personality. So personality is an individual's characteristic pattern of thinking, feeling, and acting. And there are 4 main broad areas of personality theories. You have psychoanalytic, humanistic, social cognitive, and trait theories. Starting off with my favorite, psychoanalytic theories. So psychoanalytic theories was found by Sigmund Freud, which is my fave. He's the father of psychodynamic psychology, which focuses on your conscious and unconscious mind. And so, according to Freud, the unconscious plays a big role in behaviors without the person's acknowledgement. He also believed that people's motivations and behaviors stems from the unconscious mind. And there's a popular metaphor referring to the psychoanalytic theories, and that's an iceberg. So you have this is the ocean, and you have the iceberg right here. So the tip of my fingers is your conscious mind, which is what you can see, but there's a whole chunk, the rest of my palm is all underneath the water. And this is your unconscious mind, where you do not have access to and you're not aware of. And so you might be thinking, damn, the unconscious mind plays a big role apparently, because it takes up such a large part of our mind, but we don't have access to it. And actually we do kind of have access to it, and that is through slips of tongues or dreams. And Freud always believed that dreams was like the gateway to exploring your unconscious mind. He also believed that, slips of tongues was our unconscious mind giving hints to what it really means. Freud also had a therapy technique called free association in which the therapist listens while the patient relaxes and says anything that comes to mind, and the therapist will then laterwards analyze what the patient says. Freud believed that through free association, we can also gain and analyze a little bit of a person's unconscious. Freud believed there were three components that made up your mind. You had the id, you had the superego, and you had the ego. The id is a source of mental energy of our mind that drives and operates on pleasure principles. So this drives the desire for sex and food, sleep, whatever the case may be. On the other hand, you have the superego, which is the part of the mind that is the internal representation of society rules, morals, and obligations. It's literally the exact opposite of the id. So what you can think of is you have a devil and an angel on your shoulder. The id would be the devil, and the superego would be your angel. Last but not least, you have the ego, which is the part of the mind that allows a person to function in an environment and be logical, and operates on the reality principle. It basically acts as the intermediary between your id and superego. Now let's talk about defense mechanisms, which by far was probably the most fascinating part of AP psychology for me, because I always thought that defense mechanism was just something that TikTok made famous. But actually, Freud was the founder of it. So there you have it. So there are quite a few of defense mechanisms that you should know. First is repression, which is when you banish anxiety-inducing thoughts from your consciousness. Next, you have regression, which is when you retreat back to an earlier period or a more infantile period. For instance, when you feel stressed or when you have anxiety-inducing thoughts in your mind, you might go back to behaviors of your childhood like thumb sucking. Next, you have reaction formation, which is when you unconsciously make unacceptable impulses look like they're opposite. For instance, you might feel inadequate and insecure, and this feeling of insecureness actually transfers to behaviors of bravado on the outside. Next is projection. Projection is when you disguise threatening impulses by attributing them to others. For instance, you might be thinking in your mind, oh, he doesn't trust me. But in reality, it's you that don't trust them. Next is rationalization, which is when you unconsciously generate self-justifying explanations, so rationalizing to hide ourselves the real reason for our actions. So for instance, when you fail to study, you might rationalize in your head that, oh, studying makes you a boring and dull person, so why would I do that? A few more and we're almost there. Displacement. Displacement is when you divert sexual or aggressive impulses towards an object or person that is not the source of the impulse. For instance, you got into an argument with your mom, and you take your anger out through yelling at your brother. Next is sublimation, which is the transformation of unacceptable impulses into socially valued motivation. For instance, you might feel constant anger and you might have anger issues. And so through sublimation, you might end up picking up boxing as a way to relieve that anger. And boxing is obviously more socially acceptable than, let's say, if you were to punch a kid at school. Last but not least, you have denial, which is when you protect a person from real events that are difficult and painful to accept. And this is either by rejecting a fact or its seriousness. For instance, a spouse might reject and deny evidence of their partner's affair. So I think we've touched enough on Freud. Now let's talk about some other psychodynamic psychologists. So Carl Jung. Carl Jung proposed that everyone has what's called a collective unconsciousness, which is behaviors and memories that is common to everybody that is passed down from our ancestors. And the specific behaviors and memories that are in our collective unconsciousness are referred to as archetypes. Another psychologist in the psychodynamic psychology is Alfred Adler. Adler believed that childhood is a crucial formative period where insecurity develops. And so he proposed the theory of the inferiority complex. So the inferiority complex basically states that you have a constant feeling of insecurity in your daily life, where basically you just feel inferior to others. Now let's talk about humanistic theories of personality, which emphasizes the uniqueness of being human. And if we are talking about humanistic psychology, we can't not talk about Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy of needs. So Maslow believed that a personality was fully developed once we reach self-actualization, which is when you reach the top of the hierarchy of needs and you fulfill your potentials. Another key humanistic psychologist is Carl Rogers. Rogers developed the theory of self-concept, which is our mental representation of who we feel we truly are. Basically, the answer to the who am I question. Rogers also believed that humans are nurtured by acceptance, so he believed in the unconscious positive regard, which is an attitude of total acceptance towards another person, no matter if what they did was right or wrong. Now let's go into a little bit of culture. Surprisingly enough, or not surprising at all, culture does have an impact on your personality. And there are two distinctions of cultures in AP psychology: collectivist culture and individualistic culture. Collectivistic culture stresses the importance of community, while individualistic culture stresses individuality and autonomy. Now we can talk about social cognitive theories of personality, which is based on assumptions that cognitive constructs are the basis for personality. So, a key concept in social cognitive theory is reciprocal determinism, which is the belief that environment, behavioral, and internal cognitive factors will all influence personality. And another key concept is called personal control. This is the extent to which people perceive control over their environments rather than feeling helpless. So there are two types of personal control. One is internal locus of control. The other is external locus of control. And as the name kind of tells, internal locus of control is the perception that you yourself control your own fate. Everything that happens in your life is a result of your own actions and your own efforts. On the other hand, external locus of control is the perception that chance and outside forces beyond you, beyond your control, controls your fate. Finally, we can talk about trait theories of personality, which provide quantitative systems for describing and comparing traits. And trait theorists believe that traits are inherited. And a big trait theory, I would say, or like a big personality test that like I'm sure many of you guys have heard, is called the Big Five personality trait. Which I refer to as OCEAN because that's the mnemonic I used to memorize it. So OCEAN, O stands for openness. So think of this as open-mindedness. Someone that's high on openness will be more imaginative. They have preference for variety and they're more independent compared to someone that's low on openness. They're going to be more practical, more have a higher preference for routines and more conforming. And actually, if you have taken the Big Five personality traits, please leave your test results in the comments below. I'm very curious to know. Next is C, which stands for conscientiousness. So the way to describe this is that someone that's high on conscientiousness are going to be more organized, more disciplined, and more careful compared to someone that's low on conscientiousness. They're going to be disorganized, careless, and impulsive. Next is E, which stands for extroversion, which is pretty self-explanatory. The higher the extroversion, the more social you are compared to the lower the extroversion, the more introvert you are. Next is A, which stands for agreeableness, which is exactly what it sounds. Someone that's high in agreeableness, they're going to be more compassionate, trusting, helpful, soft-hearted, compared to someone that's low on agreeableness. They're going to be ruthless, suspicious, and uncooperative. Last but not least, you have neuroticism or emotional stability. The way I think of neuroticism, though, is I think of it as the sensitivity to negative emotions. So someone that is high on neuroticism, they're going to be more sensitive to negative emotions. So they're going to be more anxious, insecure, self-pitying compared to someone that's low in neuroticism. They're going to be more calm, secure, and self-satisfied. Another trait theory is the Eysenck personality inventory. And so this trait theory basically it's like a compass. So on this side, you have extroversion, and then on this side, you have introversion. Up top, you have stability, and on the bottom, you have instability. And so I'll just give you some examples. Someone that's introverted and unstable, they're going to be moody, pessimistic. Someone that is extroverted and unstable, they're going to be restless, excitable, impulsive, active. Someone that's introverted and stable, they're going to be careful, peaceful, controlled, calm. Whereas someone that's extroverted and stable, they're going to be responsive, talkative, social, all of that. The last trait theory that I'm going to talk about is the Minnesota Multifaceted Personality Inventory, or else known as the MMPI. And before I define what the MMPI is, let's talk about what a personality inventory is. Personality inventory is a questionnaire where people respond to items designed to assess selected personality traits. And so the MMPI is often used to assess abnormal personality tendencies, so like mental health disorders, etc. Finally, we're almost there to the last part of this review, and this includes some of the miscellaneous effects. So halo effect is when one trait of a person or thing is used to make an overall judgment of that person. Spotlight effect is when you overestimate others noticing and evaluating yourself. So literally just think of it as you place a spotlight on yourself. You think that everybody is judging you 24/7. Last but not least, you have the self-serving bias. This is a readiness to perceive oneself favorably. So most people will see themselves as better than average, and most people accept more responsibility for good deeds than bad deeds, and for success than failures. So that brings us to the end of this very long unit review. I hope this was helpful. I apologize for the decrease in sound quality, but I promise that next episode we will be back in the studio where we will have the good quality podcast mics. Again, if you found this unit review helpful, please subscribe, like this video, and comment down below what unit review you would like us to do next. And we are available on all podcasting platforms, so go follow us and give us a review there as well. Thank you, and I'll see you guys in the next unit review. Peace out.